The End of the Flight, a short story by Somerset Maugham. I shook hands with the skipper, and he wished me luck. Then I went down to the lower deck crowded with passengers, Malays, Chinese, and Dayaks, and made my way to the ladder. Looking over the ship's side, I saw that my luggage was already in the boat. It was a large, clumsy-looking craft with a great square sail of bamboo matting, and it was crammed full of gesticulating natives. I scrambled in, and a place was made for me. We were about 3 miles from the shore, and a stiff breeze was blowing. As we drew near, I saw that the coconut trees in a green abundance grew to the water's edge, and among them I saw the brown roofs of the village. A Chinese who spoke English pointed out to me a white bungalow as the residence of the district officer. Though he did not know it, it was with him that I was going to stay. I had a letter of introduction to him in my pocket. I felt somewhat forlorn when I landed, and my bags were set down beside me on the glistening beach. This was a remote spot to find myself in, this little town on the north coast of Borneo, and I felt a trifle shy at the thought of presenting myself to a total stranger with the announcement that I was going to sleep under his roof, eat his food and drink his whiskey, till another boat came in to take me to the port for which I was bound. But I might have spared myself these misgivings, for the moment I reached the bungalow and sent in my letter, he came out, a sturdy, ruddy, jovial man of 35 perhaps, and greeted me with heartiness. While he held my hand, he shouted to a boy to bring drinks and to another to look after my luggage. He cut short my apologies. "Good God, man, you have no idea how glad I am to see you. Don't think I'm doing anything for you in putting you up. The boot's on the other leg, and stay as long as you damned well like. Stay a year." I laughed. He put away his day's work, assuring me that he had nothing to do that could not wait till the morrow, and threw himself into a long chair. We talked and drank and talked. When the heat of the day wore off, we went for a long tramp in the jungle and came back wet to the skin. A bath and a change were very grateful, and then we dined. I was tired out, and though my host was plainly willing to go on talking straight through the night, I was obliged to beg him to allow me to go to bed. "All right, I'll just come along to your room and see everything's all right." It was a large room with verandas on 2 sides of it, sparsely furnished, but with a huge bed protected by mosquito netting. "The bed is rather hard, do you mind?" "Not a bit. I shall sleep without rocking tonight." My host looked at the bed reflectively. It was a Dutchman who slept in it last. "Do you want to hear a funny story?" I wanted chiefly to go to bed, but he was my host, and being at times somewhat of a humorist myself, I know that it is hard to have an amusing story to tell and find no listener. "He came on the boat that brought you. On its last journey along the coast, he came into my office and asked where the Dake bungalow was. I told him there wasn't one, but if he hadn't anywhere to go, I didn't mind putting him up. He jumped at the invitation. I told him to have his kit sent along. "This is all I've got," he said. He held out a little shiny black grip. It seemed a bit scanty, but it was no business of mine, so I told him to go along to the bungalow and I'd come as soon as I was through with my work. While I was speaking, the door of my office was opened and my clerk came in. The Dutchman had his back to the door, and it may be that my clerk opened it a bit suddenly. Anyhow, the Dutchman gave a shout. He jumped about 2 feet into the air and whipped out a revolver. "What the hell are you doing?" I said. When he saw it was the clerk, he collapsed. He leaned against the desk, panting, and upon my word, he was shaking as though he'd got fever. "I beg your pardon," he said. "It's my nerves. My nerves are terrible." "It looks like it," I said. I was rather short with him. To tell you the truth, I wished I hadn't asked him to stop with me. He didn't look as though he'd been drinking a lot, and I wondered if he was some fellow the police were after. If he were, I said to myself, he could hardly be such a fool as to walk right into the lion's den. "You'd better go and lie down," I said. He took himself off, and when I got back to my bungalow, I found him sitting quite quietly, but bolt upright, on the veranda. He'd had a bath and shaved and put on clean things, and he looked fairly presentable. Why are you sitting in the middle of the place like that? I asked him. You'll be much more comfortable in one of the long chairs. I prefer to sit up, he said. Queer, I thought. But if a man in this heat would rather sit up than lie down, it's his own lookout. He wasn't much to look at, tallish and heavily built, with a square head and close-cropped bristly hair. I should think he was about 40. The thing that chiefly struck me about him was his expression. There was a look in his eyes, blue eyes they were, and rather small, that beat me altogether. And his face sagged, as it were. It gave you the feeling he was going to cry. He had a way of looking quickly over his left shoulder, as though he thought he heard something. By God, he was nervous. But we had a couple of drinks, and he began to talk. He spoke English very well. Except for a slight accent, you'd never have known that he was a foreigner, and I'm bound to admit he was a good talker. He'd been everywhere, and he'd read any amount. It was a treat to listen to him. We had 3 or 4 whiskies in the afternoon and a lot of gin pahits later on, so that when dinner came along, we were by way of being rather hilarious, and I'd come to the conclusion that he was a damn good fellow. Of course, we had a lot of whiskey at dinner, and I happened to have a bottle of Benedictine, so we had some liqueurs afterwards. I can't help thinking we both got very tight. And at last he told me why he'd come. It was a rum story. My host stopped and looked at me with his mouth slightly open, as though, remembering it now, he was struck again with its rumness. He came from Sumatra, the Dutchman, and he'd done something to an Akinese, and the Akinese had sworn to kill him. At first he made light of it, but the fellow tried 2 or 3 times, and it began to be rather a nuisance, so he thought he'd better go away for a bit. He went over to Batavia and made up his mind to have a good time. But when he'd been there a week, he saw the fellow slinking along a wall. By God, he'd followed him. It looked as though he meant business. The Dutchman began to think it was getting beyond a joke, and he thought the best thing he could do would be to skip off to Surabaya. Well, he was strolling about there one day. You know how crowded the streets are, when he happened to turn round and saw the Akinese walking quite quietly just behind him. It gave him a turn. It would give anyone a turn. The Dutchman went straight back to his hotel, packed his things, and took the next boat to Singapore. Of course, he put up at the Van Wyck. All the Dutch stay there, and one day when he was having a drink in the courtyard in front of the hotel, the Akinese walked in as bold as brass, looked at him for a minute, and walked out again. The Dutchman told me he was just paralyzed. The fellow could have stuck his kriss into him there and then, and he wouldn't have been able to move a hand to defend himself. The Dutchman knew he was just biding his time. That damn native was going to kill him. He saw it in his eyes, and he went all to pieces. But why didn't he go to the police? I asked. I don't know. I expect it wasn't a thing he wanted the police to be mixed up in. But what had he done to the man? I don't know that either. He wouldn't tell me. But by the look he gave when I asked him, I expect it was something pretty rotten. I have an idea he knew he deserved whatever the Akinese could do. My host lit a cigarette. Go on, I said. The skipper of the boat that runs between Singapore and Kuching lives at the Van Wyck between trips, and the boat was starting at dawn. The Dutchman thought it a grand chance to give the fellow the slip. He left his luggage at the hotel and walked down to the ship with the skipper, as if he were just going to see him off, and stayed on her when she sailed. His nerves were all anyhow by then. He didn't care about anything but getting rid of the Akinese. He felt pretty safe at Kuching. He got a room at the rest house and bought himself a couple of suits and some shirts in the Chinese shops. But he told me he couldn't sleep. He dreamt of that man, and 6 times he awakened just as he thought a kriss was being drawn across his throat. By God, I felt quite sorry for him. He just shook as he talked to me, and his voice was hoarse with terror. That was the meaning of the look I had noticed. You remember, I told you he had a funny look on his face, and I couldn't tell what it meant. Well, it was fear. And one day when he was in the club at Kuching, he looked out of the window and saw the Akinese sitting there. Their eyes met. The Dutchman just crumpled up and fainted. When he came to, his first idea was to get out. Well, you know, there's not a hell of a lot of traffic at Kuching, and this boat that brought you was the only one that gave him a chance to get away quickly. He got on her. He was positive the man was not on board. But what made him come here? Well, the old tramp stops at a dozen places on the coast, and the Akinese couldn't possibly guess he'd chosen this one because he only made up his mind to get off when he saw there was only one boat to take the passengers ashore, and there weren't more than a dozen people in it. "I'm safe here for a bit at all events," he said, "and if I can only be quiet for a while, I shall get my nerve back." "Stay as long as you like," I said. "You're all right here. At all events till the boat comes along next month, and if you like, we'll watch the people who come off." He was all over me. I could see what a relief it was to him. It was pretty late, and I suggested to him that we should turn in. I took him to his room to see that it was all right. He locked the door of the bathhouse and bolted the shutters, though I told him there was no risk, and when I left him, I heard him lock the door I had just gone out of. Next morning, when the boy brought me my tea, I asked him if he'd called the Dutchman. He said he was just going to. I heard him knock and knock again. Funny, I thought. The boy hammered on the door, but there was no answer. I felt a little nervous, so I got up. I knocked too. We made enough noise to rouse the dead, but the Dutchman slept on. Then I broke down the door. The mosquito curtains were neatly tucked in round the bed. I pulled them apart. He was lying there on his back with his eyes wide open. He was as dead as mutton. A kriss lay across his throat and say, "I'm a liar if you like, but I swear to God it's true. There wasn't a wound about him anywhere." The room was empty. Funny, wasn't it? "Well, that all depends on your idea of humor," I replied. My host looked at me quickly. "You don't mind sleeping in that bed, do you?" "No, but I'd just as soon you told me the story tomorrow morning." Mirage, a short story by Somerset Maugham. I had been wandering about the east for months and at last reached Haiphong. It is a commercial town and a dull one, but I knew that from there I could find a ship of sorts to take me to Hong Kong. I had some days to wait and nothing to do. It is true that from Haiphong you can visit the Bay of Along, which is one of the Sehenswürdigkeiten of Indochina, but I was tired of sights. I contented myself with sitting in the cafes, for here it was none too warm, and I was glad to get out of tropical clothes and reading back numbers of L'Illustration, or for the sake of exercise, taking a brisk walk along straight, wide streets. Haiphong is traversed by canals, and sometimes I got a glimpse of a scene which, in its varied life, with all the native craft on the water, was multicolored and charming. There was one canal, with tall Chinese houses on each side of it, that had a pleasant curve. The houses were whitewashed, but the whitewash was discolored and stained. With their grey roofs, they made an agreeable composition against the pale sky. The picture had the faded elegance of an old watercolor. There was nowhere an emphatic note. It was soft and a little weary and inspired one with a faint melancholy. I was reminded, I scarcely know why, of an old maid I knew in my youth, a relic of the Victorian age, who wore black silk mittens and made crochet shawls for the poor, black for widows and white for married women. She had suffered in her youth, but whether from ill health or unrequited love, no one exactly knew. But there was a local paper at Haiphong, a small dingy sheet with stubby type, the ink of which came off on your fingers, and it gave you a political article, the wireless news, advertisements, and local intelligence. The editor, doubtless hard-pressed for matter, printed the names of the persons, Europeans, natives of the country, and Chinese who had arrived at Haiphong or left it, and mine was put in with the rest. On the morning of the day before that, on which the old tub I was taking was to sail for Hong Kong, I was sitting in the cafe of the hotel, drinking a Dubonnet before luncheon, when the boy came in and said that a gentleman wished to see me. I did not know a soul in Haiphong and asked who it was. The boy said he was an Englishman and lived there, but he could not tell me his name. The boy spoke very little French, and it was hard for me to understand what he said. I was mystified, but told him to show the visitor in. A moment later he came back, followed by a white man, and pointed me out to him. The man gave me a look and walked towards me. He was a very tall fellow, well over 6 feet high, rather fat and bloated, with a red, clean-shaven face and extremely pale blue eyes. He wore very shabby khaki shorts and a Stenger shifter unbuttoned at the neck and a battered helmet. I concluded at once that he was a stranded beachcomber who was going to touch me for a loan and wondered how little I could hope to get off for. He came up to me and held out a large red hand with broken, dirty nails. "I don't suppose you remember me," he said. "My name's Grosley. I was at St. Thomas's Hospital with you. I recognized your name as soon as I saw it in the paper, and I thought I'd look you up." I had not the smallest recollection of him, but I asked him to sit down and offered him a drink. By his appearance, I had first thought he would ask me for 10 piastres, and I might have given him 5. But now it looked more likely that he would ask for 100, and I should have to think myself lucky if I could content him with 50. The habitual borrower always asks twice what he expects to get, and it only dissatisfies him to give him what he has asked, since then he is vexed with himself for not having asked more. He feels you have cheated him. "Are you a doctor?" I asked. "No, I was only at the bloody place a year." He took off his sun helmet and showed me a mop of grey hair, which much needed a brush. His face was curiously mottled, and he did not look healthy. His teeth were badly decayed, and at the corners of his mouth were empty spaces. When the boy came to take the orders, he asked for brandy. "Bring the bottle," he said. "La bouteille. Savvy?" He turned to me. "I've been living here for the last 5 years, but I can't get along with French somehow. I talk Tonkinese." He leaned his chair back and looked at me. "I remember you, you know. You used to go about with those twins. What was their name? I expect I've changed more than you have. I've spent the best part of my life in China. Rotten climate, you know. It plays hell with a man." I still had not the smallest recollection of him. I thought it best to say so. "Were you the same year as I was?" I asked. "Yes, 92. It's a devil of a long time ago." About 60 boys and young men entered the hospital every year. They were most of them shy and confused by the new life they were entering upon. Many had never been in London before, and to me at least, they were shadows that passed without any particular rhyme or reason across a white sheet. During the first year, a certain number, for one reason or another, dropped out, and in the second year, those that remained gained by degrees the beginnings of a personality. They were not only themselves, but the lectures one had attended with them, the scone and coffee one had eaten at the same table for luncheon, the dissection one had done at the same board in the same dissecting room, and the Belle of New York one had seen together from the pit of the Shaftesbury Theatre. The boy brought the bottle of brandy and grossly, if that was really his name, pouring himself out a generous helping, drank it down at a gulp without water or soda. "I couldn't stand doctoring," he said. "I chucked it. My people got fed up with me and I went out to China. They gave me £100 and told me to shift for myself. I was damn glad to get out, I can tell you. I guess I was just about as much fed up with them as they were with me. I haven't troubled them much since." Then, from somewhere in the depths of my memory, a faint hint crept into the rim, as it were, of consciousness, as on a rising tide, the water slides up the sand and then withdraws to advance with the next wave in a fuller volume. I had first an inkling of some shabby little scandal that had got into the papers. Then I saw a boy's face, and so gradually the facts recurred to me. I remembered him now. I didn't believe he was called Grossly then. I think he had a one-syllabled name, but that I was uncertain of. He was a very tall lad. I began to see him quite well. Thin, with a slight stoop, he was only 18 and had grown too fast for his strength. He had curly, shining brown hair, rather large features. They did not look so large now, perhaps because his face was fat and puffy, and a peculiarly fresh complexion, very pink and white, like a girl's. I imagine people, women especially, would have thought him a very handsome boy, but to us he was only a clumsy, shuffling lout. Then I remembered that he did not often come to lectures. No, it wasn't that I remembered. There were too many students in the theatre to recollect who was there and who wasn't. I remembered the dissecting room. He had a leg at the next table to the one I was working at, and he hardly ever touched it. I forget why the men who had other parts of the body complained of his neglecting the work. I suppose somehow it interfered with them. In those days, a good deal of gossip went on over the dissection of a part, and out of the distance of 30 years, some of it came back to me. Someone started the story that Grossly was a very gay dog. He drank like a fish and was an awful womanizer. Most of those boys were very simple, and they had brought to the hospital the notions they had acquired at home and at school. Some were prudish, and they were shocked. Others, those who worked hard, sneered at him and asked how he could hope to pass his exams. But a good many were excited and impressed. He was doing what they would have liked to do if they had had the courage. Grossly had his admirers, and you could often see him surrounded by a little band, listening open-mouthed to stories of his adventures. Recollections now were crowding upon me. In a very little while, he lost his shyness and assumed the airs of a man of the world. They must have looked absurd on this smooth-cheeked boy with his pink and white skin. Men, so they called themselves, used to tell one another of his escapades. He became quite a hero. He would make caustic remarks as he passed the museum and saw a pair of earnest students going over their anatomy together. He was at home in the public houses of the neighborhood and was on familiar terms with the barmaids. Looking back, I imagine that, newly arrived from the country and the tutelage of parents and schoolmasters, he was captivated by his freedom and the thrill of London. His dissipations were harmless enough. They were due only to the urge of youth. He lost his head. But we were all very poor, and we did not know how Grossly managed to pay for his garish amusements. We knew his father was a country doctor, and I think we knew exactly how much he gave his son a month. It was not enough to pay for the harlots he picked up on the promenade at the pavilion, and for the drinks he stood his friends in the Criterion bar. We told one another in awe-struck tones that he must be getting fearfully into debt. Of course he could pawn things, but we knew by experience that you could not get more than £3 for a microscope and 30 shillings for a skeleton. We said he must be spending at least £10 a week. Our ideas were not very grand, and this seemed to us the wildest pitch of extravagance. At last, one of his friends disclosed the mystery. Grossly had discovered a wonderful system for making money. It amused and impressed us. None of us would have thought of anything so ingenious or have had the nerve to attempt it if he had. Grosley went to auctions, not Christie's, of course, but auctions in the Strand and Oxford Street, and in private houses, and bought anything portable that was going cheap. Then he took his purchase to a pawnbroker's and pawned it for 10 shillings or £1 more than he had paid. He was making money, £4 or £5 a week, and he said he was going to give up medicine and make a regular business of it. Not one of us had ever made a penny in his life, and we regarded Grosley with admiration. "By Jove, he's clever," we said. "He's just about as sharp as they make them. That's the sort that ends up as a millionaire." We were all very worldly wise, and what we didn't know about life at 18, we were pretty sure wasn't worth knowing. It was a pity that when an examiner asked us a question, we were so nervous that the answer often flew straight out of our head, and when a nurse asked us to post a letter, we blushed scarlet. It became known that the dean had sent for Grosley and hauled him over the coals. He had threatened him with sundry penalties if he continued systematically to neglect his work. Grosley was indignant. He'd had enough of that sort of thing at school, he said. He wasn't going to let a horse-faced eunuch treat him like a boy. Damn it all, he was getting on for 19 and there wasn't much you could teach him. The dean had said he heard he was drinking more than was good for him. Damned cheek. He could carry his liquor as well as any man of his age. He'd been blind last Saturday and he meant to get blind next Saturday, and if anyone didn't like it, he could do the other thing. Grosley's friends quite agreed with him that a man couldn't let himself be insulted like that, but the blow fell at last, and now I remembered quite well the shock it gave us all. I suppose we had not seen Grosley for 2 or 3 days, but he had been in the habit of coming to the hospital more and more irregularly, so if we thought anything about it, I imagine we merely said that he was off on one of his bats. He would turn up again in a day or so, rather pale, but with a wonderful story of some girl he had picked up and the time he had had with her. The anatomy lecture was at 9 in the morning, and it was a rush to get there in time. On this particular day, little attention was paid to the lecturer, who, with a visible pleasure in his limpid English and admirable elocution, was describing I know not what part of the human skeleton, for there was much excited whispering along the benches, and a newspaper was surreptitiously passed from hand to hand. Suddenly the lecturer stopped. He had a pedagogic sarcasm. He affected not to know the names of his students. "I'm afraid I'm disturbing the gentleman who is reading the paper. Anatomy is a very tedious science, and I regret that the regulations of the Royal College of Surgeons oblige me to ask you to give it enough of your attention to pass an examination in it. Any gentleman, however, who finds this impossible is at liberty to continue his perusal of the paper outside." The wretched boy to whom this reproof was addressed reddened to the roots of his hair, and in his embarrassment tried to stuff the newspaper in his pocket. The professor of anatomy observed him coldly. "I am afraid, sir, that the paper is a little too large to go into your pocket," he remarked. "Perhaps you would be good enough to hand it down to me." The newspaper was passed from row to row to the well of the theatre, and not content with the confusion to which he had put the poor lad, the eminent surgeon, taking it, asked, "May I inquire what it is in the paper that the gentleman in question found of such absorbing interest?" The student who gave it to him without a word pointed out the paragraph that we had all been reading. The professor read it, and we watched him in silence. He put the paper down and went on with his lecture. The headline ran, "Arrest of a medical student." Grosley had been brought before the police court magistrate for getting goods on credit and pawning them. It appears that this is an indictable offence, and the magistrate had remanded him for a week. Bail was refused. It looked as though his method of making money by buying things at auctions and pawning them had not in the long run proved as steady a source of income as he expected, and he had found it more profitable to pawn things that he was not at the expense of paying for. We talked the matter over excitedly as soon as the lecture was over, and I am bound to say that, having no property ourselves, so deficient was our sense of its sanctity, we could none of us look upon his crime as a very serious one. But with the natural love of the young for the terrible, there were few who did not think he would get anything from 2 years' hard labor to 7 years' penal servitude. I do not know why, but I did not seem to have any recollection of what happened to Grosley. I think he may have been arrested towards the end of a session, and his case may have come on again when we had all separated for holidays. I did not know if it was disposed of by the police court magistrate or whether it went up for trial. I had a sort of feeling that he was sentenced to a short term of imprisonment, 6 weeks perhaps, for his operations had been pretty extensive. But I knew that he had vanished from our midst, and in a little while was thought of no more. It was strange to me that after all these years I should recollect so much of the incident so clearly. It was as though, turning over an album of old snapshots, I saw all at once the photograph of a scene I had quite forgotten. But of course, in that gross, elderly man with grey hair and mottled red face, I should never have recognized the lanky, pink-cheeked boy. He looked 60, but I knew he must be much less than that. I wondered what he had done with himself in the intervening time. It did not look as though he had excessively prospered. "What were you doing in China?" I asked him. "I was a tide waiter." "Oh, were you?" It is not a position of great importance, and I took care to keep out of my tone any note of surprise. The tide waiters are employees of the Chinese customs whose duty it is to board the ships and junks at the various treaty ports, and I think their chief business is to prevent opium smuggling. They are mostly retired ABS from the Royal Navy and non-commissioned officers who have finished their time. I have seen them come on board at various places up the Yangtze. They hobnob with the pilot and the engineer, but the skipper is a trifle curt with them. They learn to speak Chinese more fluently than most Europeans and often marry Chinese women. When I left England, I swore I wouldn't go back till I'd made my pile, and I never did. They were glad enough to get anyone to be a tide waiter in those days, any white man I mean, and they didn't ask questions. They didn't care who you were. I was damn glad to get the job, I can tell you. I was about broke to the wide when they took me on. I only took it till I could get something better, but I stayed on. It suited me. I wanted to make money, and I found out that a tide waiter could make a packet if he knew the right way to go about it. I was with the Chinese customs for the best part of 25 years, and when I came away, I wouldn't mind betting that lots of commissioners would have been glad to have the money I had. He gave me a sly, mean look. I had an inkling of what he meant, but there was a point on which I was willing to be reassured. If he was going to ask me for 100 piastres, I was resigned to that sum now. I thought I might just as well take the blow at once. "I hope you kept it," I said. "You bet I did. I invested all my money in Shanghai, and when I left China, I put it all in American railway bonds. Safety first is my motto. I know too much about crooks to take any risks myself." I liked that remark, so I asked him if he wouldn't stay and have luncheon with me. "No, I don't think I will. I don't eat much tiffin, and anyway, my chow's waiting for me at home. I think I'll be getting along." He got up and he towered over me. "But look here, why don't you come along this evening and see my place? I've married a Haiphong girl. Got a baby too. It's not often I get a chance of talking to anyone about London. You'd better not come to dinner. We only eat native food, and I don't suppose you'd care for that. Come along about 9, will you?" "All right," I said, and I had already told him that I was leaving Haiphong next day. He asked the boy to bring him a piece of paper so that he might write down his address. He wrote laboriously in the hand of a boy of 14. "Tell the porter to explain to your rickshaw boy where it is. I'm on the 2nd floor. There's no bell. Just knock. We'll see you later." He walked out and I went into luncheon. After dinner, I called a rickshaw and with the porter's help, made the boy understand where I wanted to go. I found presently that he was taking me along the curved canal, the houses of which had looked to me so like a faded Victorian watercolor. He stopped at one of them and pointed to the door. It looked so shabby, and the neighborhood was so squalid that I hesitated, thinking he had made a mistake. It seemed unlikely that Grosley could live so far in the native quarter and in a house so bedraggled. I told the rickshaw boy to wait, and pushing open the door, saw a dark staircase in front of me. There was no one about, and the street was empty. It might have been the small hours of the morning. I struck a match and fumbled my way upstairs. On the second floor, I struck another match and saw a large brown door in front of me. I knocked, and in a moment, it was opened by a little Tonkinese woman holding a candle. She was dressed in the earth brown of the poorer classes, with a tight little black turban on her head. Her lips and the skin round them were stained red with beetle, and when she opened her mouth to speak, I saw that she had the black teeth and black gums that so disfigure these people. She said something in her native language, and then I heard Grosley's voice. "Come along in. I was beginning to think you weren't going to turn up." I passed through a little dark antechamber and entered a large room that evidently looked on the canal. Grosley was lying on a long chair, and he raised his length from it as I came in. He was reading the Hong Kong papers by the light of a paraffin lamp that stood on a table by his side. "Sit down," he said, "and put your feet up. There's no reason I should take your chair. Go on, I'll sit on this." He took a kitchen chair and, sitting on it, put his feet on the end of mine. "That's my wife," he said, pointing with his thumb at the Tonkinese woman who had followed me into the room. "And over there in the corner's the kid." I followed his eyes, and against the wall, lying on bamboo mats and covered with a blanket, I saw a child sleeping. Lively little beggar when he's awake. I wish you could have seen him. She's going to have another soon. I glanced at her, and the truth of what he said was apparent. She was very small, with tiny hands and feet, but her face was flat and the skin muddy. She looked sullen, but may only have been shy. She went out of the room and presently came back with a bottle of whiskey, 2 glasses, and a siphon. I looked round. There was a partition at the back of dark, unpainted wood, which I suppose shut off another room, and pinned against the middle of this was a portrait cut out of an illustrated paper of John Galsworthy. He looked austere, mild, and gentlemanly, and I wondered what he did there. The other walls were whitewashed, but the whitewash was dingy and stained. Pinned onto them were pages of pictures from the Graphic or the Illustrated London News. "I put them up," said Grosley. "I thought they made the place look homelike." "What made you put up Galsworthy? Do you read his books?" "No, I didn't know he wrote books. I liked his face." There were 1 or 2 torn and shabby rattan mats on the floor, and in a corner, a great pile of the Hong Kong Times. The only furniture consisted of a wash-hand stand, 2 or 3 kitchen chairs, a table or 2, and a large teak native bed. It was cheerless and sordid. "Not a bad little place, is it?" said Grosley. "Suits me all right. Sometimes I've thought of moving, but I don't suppose I ever shall now." He gave a little chuckle. "I came to Haiphong for 48 hours, and I've been here 5 years. I was on my way to Shanghai, really." He was silent. Having nothing to say, I said nothing. Then the little Tonkinese woman made a remark to him, which I could not, of course, understand, and he answered her. He was silent again for a minute or 2, but I thought he looked at me as though he wanted to ask me something. I did not know why he hesitated. "Have you ever tried smoking opium on your travels in the East?" he inquired at last, casually. "Yes, I did once at Singapore. I thought I'd like to see what it was like." "What happened?" "Nothing very thrilling, to tell you the truth. I thought I was going to have the most exquisite emotions. I expected visions like De Quincey's, you know. The only thing I felt was a kind of physical well-being. The same sort of feeling that you get when you've had a Turkish bath and are lying in the cooling room, and then a peculiar activity of mind, so that everything I thought of seemed extremely clear. I know. I really felt that 2 and 2 are 4, and there could not be the smallest doubt about it. But next morning, oh God, my head reeled. I was as sick as a dog. I was sick all day. I vomited my soul out, and as I vomited, I said to myself miserably, "And there are people who call this fun." Grossly leaned back in his chair and gave a low, mirthless laugh. "I expect it was bad stuff, or you went at it too hard. They saw you were a mug and gave you dregs that had been smoked already. They're enough to turn anybody up. Would you like to have another try now? I've got some stuff here that I know's good." "No, I think once was enough for me." "Do you mind if I have a pipe or two? You want it in a climate like this. It keeps you from getting dysentery, and I generally have a bit of a smoke about this time." "Go ahead," I said. He spoke again to the woman, and she, raising her voice, called out something in a raucous tone. An answer came from the room behind the wooden partition, and after a minute or two, an old woman came out carrying a little round tray. She was shriveled and old, and when she entered gave me an ingratiating smile of her stained mouth. Grossly got up and crossed over to the bed and lay on it. The old woman set the tray down on the bed. On it was a spirit lamp, a pipe, a long needle, and a little round box of opium. She squatted on the bed, and Grossly's wife got on it too and sat, her feet tucked up under her with her back against the wall. Grossly watched the old woman while she put a little pellet of the drug on the needle, held it over the flame till it sizzled, and then plugged it into the pipe. She handed it to him, and with a great breath, he inhaled it. He held the smoke for a little while and then blew it out in a thick, grey cloud. He handed her back the pipe, and she started to make another. Nobody spoke. He smoked 3 pipes in succession and then sank back. "By George, I feel better now. I was feeling all in. She makes a wonderful pipe, this old hag. Are you sure you won't have one?" "Quite. Please yourself. Have some tea, then." He spoke to his wife, who scrambled off the bed and went out of the room. Presently, she came back with a little china pot of tea and a couple of Chinese bowls. "A lot of people smoke here, you know. It does you no harm if you don't do it to excess. I never smoke more than 20 to 25 pipes a day. You can go on for years if you limit yourself to that. Some of the Frenchmen smoke as many as 40 or 50 a day. That's too much. I never do that, except now and then when I feel I want to binge. I'm bound to say it's never done me any harm." We drank our tea, pale and vaguely scented and clean on the palate. Then the old woman made him another pipe, and then another. His wife had got back onto the bed, and soon curling herself up at his feet, went to sleep. Grossly smoked 2 or 3 pipes at a time, and while he was smoking seemed intent upon nothing else. But in the intervals he was loquacious. Several times I suggested going, but he would not let me. The hours wore on. Once or twice while he smoked I dozed. He told me all about himself. He went on and on. I spoke only to give him a cue. I cannot relate what he told me in his own words. He repeated himself. He was very long-winded, and he told me his story confusedly, first a late bit, then an early bit, so that I had to arrange the sequence for myself. Sometimes I saw that, afraid he had said too much, he held something back. Sometimes he lied, and I had to make a guess at the truth from the smile he gave me or the look in his eyes. He had not the words to describe what he had felt, and I had to conjecture his meaning from slangy metaphors and hackneyed, vulgar phrases. I kept on asking myself what his real name was. It was on the tip of my tongue, and it irritated me not to be able to recall it, though why it should, in the least matter to me, I did not know. He was somewhat suspicious of me at first, and I saw that this escapade of his in London and his imprisonment had been all these years a tormenting secret. He had always been haunted by the fear that sooner or later someone would find out. It's funny that even now you shouldn't remember me at the hospital, he said, looking at me shrewdly. You must have a rotten memory. Hang it all, it's nearly 30 years ago. Think of the thousands of people I've met since then. There's no reason why I should remember you any more than you remember me. That's right. I don't suppose there is. It seemed to reassure him. At last he had smoked enough, and the old woman made herself a pipe and smoked it. Then she went over to the mat on which the child was lying and huddled down beside it. She lay so still that I supposed she had fallen directly asleep. When at last I went, I found my boy curled up on the footboard of the rickshaw in so deep a slumber that I had to shake him. I knew where I was and I wanted air and exercise, so I gave him a couple of piastres and told him I would walk. It was a strange story I carried away with me. It was with a sort of horror that I had listened to Grossly, telling me of those 20 years he had spent in China. He had made money, I do not know how much, but from the way he talked, I should think something between 15 and 20,000 pounds, and for a tide waiter, it was a fortune. He could not have come by it honestly, and little as I knew of the details of his trade, by his sudden reticences, by his leers and hints, I guessed that there was no base transaction that, if it was made worth his while, he jibbed at. I suppose that nothing paid him better than smuggling opium, and his position gave him the opportunity to do this with safety and profit. I understood that his superior officers had often had their suspicions of him, but had never been able to get such proof of his malpractices as to justify them in taking any steps. They contented themselves with moving him from one port to another, but that did not disturb him. They watched him, but he was too clever for them. I saw that he was divided between the fear of telling me too much to his discredit and the desire to boast of his own astuteness. He prided himself on the confidence the Chinese had placed in him. They knew they could trust me, he said, and it gave me a pull. I never double-crossed a Chinaman once. The thought filled him with the complacency of the honest man. The Chinese discovered that he was keen on curios, and they got in the habit of giving him bits or bringing him things to buy. He never made inquiries how they had come by them, and he bought them cheap. When he had got a good lot, he sent them to Peking and sold them at a handsome profit. I remembered how he had started his commercial career by buying things at auctions and pawning them. For 20 years, by shabby shift and petty dishonesty, he added pound to pound, and everything he made he invested in Shanghai. He lived penuriously, saving half his pay. He never went on leave because he did not want to waste his money. He would not have anything to do with the Chinese women. He wanted to keep himself free from any entanglement. He did not drink. He was consumed by one ambition, to save enough to be able to go back to England and live the life from which he had been snatched as a boy. That was the only thing he wanted. He lived in China as though in a dream. He paid no attention to the life around him. Its color and strangeness, its possibilities of pleasure, meant nothing to him. There was always before him the Mirage of London, the Criterion Bar, himself standing with his foot on the rail, the promenade at the Empire and the Pavilion, the picked-up harlot, the serio-comic at the music hall, and the musical comedy at the Gaiety. This was life and love and adventure. This was romance. This was what he yearned for with all his heart. There was surely something impressive in the way in which during all those years he had lived like an anchorite, with that one end, in view of leading again a life that was so vulgar. It showed character. You see, he said to me, even if I'd been able to get back to England on leave, I wouldn't have gone. I didn't want to go till I could go for good, and then I wanted to do the thing in style. He saw himself putting on evening clothes every night and going out with a gardenia in his buttonhole, and he saw himself going to the Derby in a long coat and a brown hat and a pair of opera glasses slung over his shoulder. He saw himself giving the girls a look over and picking out the one he fancied. He made up his mind that on the night he arrived in London, He would get blind. He hadn't been drunk for 20 years. He couldn't afford to in his job. You had to keep your wits about you. He'd take care not to get drunk on the ship on the way home. He'd wait till he got to London. What a night he'd have. He thought of it for 20 years. I do not know why Grosley left the Chinese customs, whether the place was getting too hot for him, whether he had reached the end of his service, or whether he had amassed the sum he had fixed. But at last, he sailed. He went second class. He did not intend to start spending money till he reached London. He took rooms in Jermyn Street. He had always wanted to live there, and he went straight to a tailor's and ordered himself an outfit. Slap up. Then he had a look round the town. It was different from how he remembered it. There was much more traffic, and he felt confused and a little at sea. He went to the Criterion and found there was no longer a bar where he had been used to lounge and drink. There was a restaurant in Leicester Square where he had been in the habit of dining when he was in funds, but he could not find it. He supposed it had been torn down. He went to the Pavilion, but there were no women there. He was rather disgusted and went on to the Empire. He found they had done away with the promenade. It was rather a blow. He could not quite make it out. Well, anyhow, he must be prepared for changes in 20 years, and if he couldn't do anything else, he could get drunk. He had had fever several times in China, and the change of climate had brought it on again. He wasn't feeling any too well, and after 4 or 5 drinks he was glad to go to bed. That first day was only a sample of many that followed it. Everything went wrong. Grosley's voice grew peevish and bitter as he told me how one thing and another had failed him. The old places were gone. The people were different. He found it hard to make friends. He was strangely lonely. He had never expected that in a great city like London. That's what was wrong with it. London had become too big. It wasn't the jolly, intimate place it had been in the early 90s. It had gone to pieces. He picked up a few girls, but they weren't as nice as the girls he had known before. They weren't the fun they used to be. And he grew dimly conscious that they thought him a rum sort of cove. He was only just over 40, and they looked upon him as an old man. When he tried to cotton on to a lot of young fellows standing round a bar, they gave him the cold shoulder. Anyway, these young fellows didn't know how to drink. He'd show them. He got soused every night. It was the only thing to do in that damned place, but by Jove, it made him feel rotten next day. He supposed it was the climate of China. When he was a medical student, he could drink a bottle of whiskey every night and be as fresh as a daisy in the morning. He began to think more about China. All sorts of things that he never knew he had noticed came back to him. It wasn't a bad life he'd led there. Perhaps he'd been a fool to keep away from those Chinese girls. They were pretty little things, some of them, and they didn't put on the airs these English girls did. One could have a damned good time in China if one had the money he had. One could keep a Chinese girl and get into the club, and there'd be a lot of nice fellows to drink with and play bridge with and billiards. He remembered the Chinese shops and all the row in the streets and the coolies carrying loads and the ports with the junks in them and the rivers with pagodas on the banks. It was funny. He never thought much of China while he was there, and now, well, he couldn't get it out of his mind. It obsessed him. He began to think that London was no place for a white man. It had just gone to the dogs, that was the long and short of it. And one day, the thought came to him that perhaps it would be a good thing if he went back to China. Of course it was silly. He'd worked like a slave for 20 years to be able to have a good time in London, and it was absurd to go and live in China. With his money, he ought to be able to have a good time anywhere. But somehow, he couldn't think of anything else but China. One day, he went to the pictures and saw a scene at Shanghai. That settled it. He was fed up with London. He hated it. He was going to get out, and this time he'd get out for good. He had been home a year and a half, and it seemed longer to him than all his 20 years in the East. He took a passage on a French boat, sailing from Marseille, and when he saw the coast of Europe sink into the sea, he heaved a great sigh of relief. When they got to Suez and he felt the first touch of the East, he knew he had done the right thing. Europe was finished. The East was the only place. He went ashore at Djibouti and again at Colombo and Singapore, but though the ship stopped for 2 days at Saigon, he remained on board there. He'd been drinking a good deal, and he was feeling a bit under the weather. But when they reached Haiphong, where they were staying for 48 hours, he thought he might just as well have a look at it. That was the last stopping place before they got to China. He was bound for Shanghai. When he got there, he meant to go to a hotel and look around a bit and then get hold of a girl and a place of his own. He would buy a pony or two and race. He'd soon make friends. In the East, they weren't so stiff and standoffish as they were in London. Going ashore, he dined at the hotel and after dinner got into a rickshaw and told the boy he wanted a woman. The boy took him to the shabby tenement in which I had sat for so many hours, and there were the old woman and the girl who was now the mother of his child. After a while, the old woman asked him if he wouldn't like to smoke. He had never tried opium. He had always been frightened of it, but now he didn't see why he shouldn't have a go. He was feeling good that night, and the girl was a jolly, cuddlesome little thing. She was rather like a Chinese girl, small and pretty, like an idol. Well, he had a pipe or two, and he began to feel very happy and comfortable. He stayed all night. He didn't sleep. He just lay, feeling very restful, and thought about things. "I stopped there till my ship went on to Hong Kong," he said, "and when she left, I just stopped on." "How about your luggage?" I asked, for I am perhaps unworthily interested in the manner people combine practical details with the ideal aspects of life. When in a novel, penniless lovers drive in a long, swift racing car over the distant hills, I have always a desire to know how they manage to pay for it. And I have often asked myself how the characters of Henry James, in the intervals of subtly examining their situation, coped with the physiological necessities of their bodies. I only had a trunk full of clothes. I was never one to want much more than I stood up in, and I went down with the girl in a rickshaw to fetch it. I only meant to stay on till the next boat came through. You see, I was so near China here, I thought I'd wait a bit and get used to things, if you understand what I mean, before I went on. I did. Those last words of his revealed him to me. I knew that on the threshold of China his courage had failed him. England had been such a terrible disappointment that now he was afraid to put China to the test too. If that failed him, he had nothing. For years, England had been like a mirage in the desert, but when he had yielded to the attraction, those shining pools and the palm trees and the green grass were nothing but the rolling, sandy dunes. He had China, and so long as he never saw it again, he kept it. Somehow I stayed on. You know, you'd be surprised how quickly the days pass. I don't seem to have time to do half the things I want to. After all, I'm comfortable here. The old woman makes a damned good pipe. And she's a jolly little girl, my girl. And then there's the kid, a lively young beggar. If you're happy somewhere, what's the good of going somewhere else? "And are you happy here?" I asked him. I looked round that large, bare, sordid room. There was no comfort in it, and not one of the little personal things that one would have thought might have given him the feeling of home. Grosley had taken on this equivocal little apartment, which served as a house of assignation and as a place for Europeans to smoke opium in, with the old woman who kept it just as it was, and he camped, rather than lived, there still, as though next day he would pack his traps and go. After a little while, he answered my question. "I've never been so happy in my life. I often think I'll go on to Shanghai someday, but I don't suppose I ever shall. And God knows, I never want to see England again." "Aren't you awfully lonely sometimes for people to talk to?" "No. Sometimes a Chinese tramp comes in with an English skipper or a Scotch engineer. And then I go on board and we have a talk about old times. There's an old fellow here, a Frenchman who is in the customs, and he speaks English. I go and see him sometimes, but the fact is, I don't want anybody very much. I think a lot. It gets on my nerves when people come between me and my thoughts. I'm not a big smoker, you know. I just have a pipe or two in the morning to settle my stomach, but I don't really smoke till night. Then I think. What do you think about? Oh, all sorts of things. Sometimes about London and what it was like when I was a boy, but mostly about China. I think of the good times I had and the way I made my money, and I remember the fellows I used to know, and the Chinese. I had some narrow squeaks now and then, but I always came through all right. And I wonder what the girls would have been like that I might have had. Pretty little things. I'm sorry now I didn't keep one or two. It's a great country, China. I love those shops, with an old fellow sitting on his heels smoking a water pipe, and all the shop signs, and the temples. By George, that's the place for a man to live in. There's life. The mirage shone before his eyes. The illusion held him. He was happy. I wondered what would be his end. Well, that was not yet. For the first time in his life, perhaps he held the present in his hand.